Everyone in the mansion had already given up. The doctors said the twins would never move, never speak, never live a normal life. Their father, Michael Turner, believed it too. For years, his house was filled with silence, cold and heavy like a grave. But one afternoon, that silence broke. From the nursery upstairs came a sound no one had ever heard before. It was soft, trembling, and human. A child's voice whispered one word that froze the billionaire where he stood, a word that would change everything, forever. Michael Turner was the kind of man who carried his pain like a shadow. Every morning, he wore the same black suit, drove to his company in the same car, and came home at the same time. His life moved like a clock that had no feelings left inside it. Since his wife Laura died 2 years ago, everything in his mansion stopped feeling alive. The curtains stayed closed, the flowers in the garden dried up, and even the air felt empty. Inside the mansion were 2 small boys, Ethan and Noah. They were 6, but their world was nothing like other children's. They couldn't walk or talk, their bodies were stiff, and their faces showed no expression. Nurses came and went, therapists tried and failed, and every time someone promised hope, it ended the same way, with silence. Michael had stopped hoping. He told himself it was better not to believe in miracles. He built walls around his heart and drowned himself in work. The mansion became a place of quiet order, where nothing ever changed. Until the day Grace Johnson arrived. Grace was not hired to care for the boys. She was only a maid, a quiet woman in her early 30s who needed a job. She spoke softly and kept to herself. On her first day, she walked through the mansion with her cleaning bucket, careful not to make a sound. But something about her presence was different. She didn't move like someone who was afraid of silence. She moved like someone who had learned to live with it. The first time Grace saw the twins, they were lying on their special chairs by the window. Their eyes were open, but they didn't follow anything. She stood there for a moment, watching them breathe. Then, without thinking, she whispered a small hello. Her voice was gentle, almost like a lullaby. "Hi, my name is Grace," she said softly, setting down her cleaning rag. "I'll be working here for a while." The boys didn't move, but something strange happened. Their eyes shifted slightly, as if trying to find the sound. Grace smiled. It was small, patient, and warm. "I like your room," she continued quietly. "It's bright, but maybe too quiet, right?" She didn't expect a reply, but for the first time in months, Ethan blinked twice. The nurse in the corner didn't notice, but Grace did. She paused, her heart stirring. She didn't know why, but she kept talking. When Michael came home that evening, the air inside the mansion felt different. It wasn't louder, but lighter, somehow softer. He didn't think much of it. He simply walked upstairs, glanced into the twins' room, and saw Grace cleaning near their chairs. He looked at her once, then turned away. She lowered her eyes and said quietly, "Good evening, sir." He gave a polite nod and left, unaware that his sons were slowly changing. Over the next few days, Grace began humming while she worked, soft old songs she remembered from her childhood. At first, she did it to fill the quiet, but every time she sang, Ethan's hand twitched, or Noah's eyes flickered toward her. She noticed it, even if no one else did. One morning, while wiping the window, Grace saw Ethan's fingers curl slightly around the edge of his blanket. It was such a tiny movement that she almost thought she imagined it. But then Noah made a faint sound, a soft breath that wasn't just air, it was like he was trying to form a word. Grace froze, then slowly knelt beside them. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe, little ones." When Michael entered later that night, he stopped at the doorway again. Grace was on the floor beside the twins, reading from a children's book. Her voice was calm and full of feeling, her hand resting gently on Noah's arm. Michael frowned. "You were hired to clean, not to babysit," he said coldly. Grace looked up startled, then lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied softly. They were awake. I just thought maybe they needed someone to talk to. They have nurses for that," Michael said, his tone firm. "I know," Grace said quietly, "but they don't talk to them." For a long moment, the two stood in silence. Michael's eyes softened for a second before he turned and left. But that night, when he lay in bed, the image of her sitting with his boys stayed in his mind. The next morning, he left early, as always. He didn't see what happened later that afternoon. Grace was dusting the shelves near the nursery when she heard a small noise. It was so faint she thought it was the wind. Then she heard it again, a soft, broken sound. She turned around and saw Ethan's lips moving. Her heart skipped. She knelt quickly beside him. "Ethan," she whispered, "can you say that again?" No sound came, but Noah's hand began to move too. Slowly, shakily, both boys turned toward her. Their faces were filled with effort, their eyes full of something alive. Grace didn't move. She stayed right there, her voice trembling as she said, "It's okay. Take your time." Then it happened. A single fragile word slipped from Ethan's mouth. "Ma," Grace gasped softly, tears filling her eyes. She didn't move or speak, afraid it would break the moment. Downstairs, Michael had just come home early. He was still wearing his coat when he heard the faint sound from above. He froze, his briefcase hanging from his hand. The sound came again, clearer this time, from the nursery. He walked slowly up the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. There, on the floor, Grace knelt before his sons. Ethan's small hand reached toward her. Noah's lips trembled as he tried to repeat his brother's word. "Ma." The world around Michael went still. His throat tightened, his knees weakened, his heart forgot how to beat. For the first time in 6 years, his sons had spoken, but not to him, to the maid. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. The sound he had just heard was still echoing in his mind, soft but sharp enough to break the silence that had ruled his mansion for years. His sons had spoken, but the word didn't belong to him, it belonged to her, the maid. Grace turned around slowly, her face pale and wet with tears. She hadn't noticed him at first. The twins' small hands were still reaching toward her, their lips trembling, as if afraid that if they stopped, the moment would disappear. Michael's voice finally came out, low and unsteady. "What did you do to them?" Grace blinked in surprise. "Sir, I didn't do anything, they just—" "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his chest rising with anger he didn't understand. "They've never made a sound, not once, not even with doctors and therapists. And now suddenly, this?" Grace stayed calm, her voice gentle but firm. "I didn't make them do anything, sir. I was only talking to them, the way a mother talks to her children. I didn't expect this either." Michael clenched his fists. "You're not their mother," he said, his tone sharp, his words cutting through the quiet. Grace lowered her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know I'm not," she whispered, "but they needed someone to see them, someone to listen. Children don't understand money, they don't understand contracts, they only understand love." Her words hung in the air like a mirror he didn't want to look into. For the first time in a long time, Michael had nothing to say. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes moving between her and his sons. Ethan's hand was still lifted, trembling in the air. Noah's eyes were fixed on Grace, as if afraid she would vanish. The nurse standing nearby was too shocked to move. Michael finally turned away. "That will be all for tonight," he said quietly, his voice stripped of emotion. "Please leave the room." Grace nodded, her hands shaking as she picked up her cleaning cloth and left. She didn't look back, though her heart ached to. The twins watched her go, their faces falling back into quiet stillness. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the glass of untouched whiskey on his desk. His mind kept replaying the sound, "Ma." It was faint, broken, but real. Every time he heard it, his chest tightened. He remembered when Laura was alive, how the house used to echo with laughter, how she used to sing to the boys, even when they couldn't respond. She believed they could hear her. Michael didn't. He told her it was useless, that she was hurting herself with false hope. But now, years later, a stranger's voice had done what he once called impossible. The next morning, he left for work early, trying to bury the thought in meetings and calls, but it followed him like a shadow. When he came home that evening, he didn't go straight to his room as usual. He walked quietly toward the nursery. The door was open. Grace was inside, sitting on the rug beside the twins. She was reading from a picture book, her voice soft and slow. Ethan's eyes followed the movement of her hand as she turned each page. Noah's mouth twitched like he wanted to smile. Michael didn't interrupt. He stood at the doorway, hidden, watching. Grace read a story about a bird learning to fly. Every time she paused, she asked them simple questions, even though they couldn't reply. "Do you think the bird is scared?" she asked gently. "Maybe he's brave, even if he can't speak." Her voice was full of warmth, and every word felt alive. For the first time, Michael noticed how calm the twins looked. Their breathing was steady, their eyes soft. The room that once felt like a hospital now felt like home. Grace closed the book and looked at the boys. "I believe one day you'll talk again," she whispered. "Even if it's just one word a day, it will be enough." Michael stepped away quietly, his throat tightening. He didn't know why, but he couldn't bring himself to stop her this time. Later that night, as he passed by the hallway, he heard something faint, a voice, low and familiar, humming a song. He followed the sound until he reached the twins' room. The lights were dim, and Grace was sitting beside their beds, singing softly. Michael froze again. The song she was humming, it was Laura's lullaby, a tune no one else should have known. His breath caught in his chest. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Grace turned, startled. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disturb you. I found it written down in a notebook behind the nursery shelf." She reached for a small, worn notebook on the bedside table. It was covered in dust. "I think it belonged to your wife." Michael stepped closer, his eyes locked on the notebook. He took it in his trembling hands. Inside were handwritten notes, Laura's handwriting. There were recipes, small messages, and at the top of one page, written in her neat cursive, were the words, "For when I'm not there." He sank slowly into the chair beside the bed, staring at the pages. Every line carried her voice, her warmth, her love. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. Grace watched him silently, her heart heavy with respect. After a long moment, Michael spoke in a broken whisper. "She used to sing this song every night before bed. I told her it was pointless. She said love never goes to waste." Grace's voice trembled as she said, "She was right, sir. Nothing given in love is ever wasted." For the first time in 2 years, Michael wept. Not quietly, not politely, he wept like a man who had held everything in too long. Grace stayed still, giving him silence and space. When his tears slowed, he looked up at her. "Keep reading to them," he said softly. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Grace nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, sir." That night, as she walked to her small room at the end of the hall, Grace smiled faintly. For the first time since she arrived, the mansion didn't feel cold anymore. In the nursery, Michael sat beside his sleeping sons. The notebook lay open on his lap, the lullaby written in his wife's hand. The words blurred through his tears, but one sentence stood out clearly, almost glowing under the lamplight. "If you ever forget how to love, listen to their silence. It will teach you again." Michael looked at his sons, their small faces calm and peaceful. For the first time, he whispered a promise to them, his voice shaking but real. "I'm going to try again, my boys," he said quietly. "I'm going to try." The days that followed were different. They didn't change overnight, but something inside the mansion began to breathe again. The air felt lighter, the silence wasn't so heavy, and for the first time in years, the rooms carried the sound of life. Grace still came in quietly each morning, but her footsteps no longer echoed in emptiness. There was warmth now, even in the small things. Michael started coming home earlier. At first, he told himself it was because he needed to check on the boys' progress, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the real reason. Something about Grace's calmness drew him in. He didn't understand it yet, but her presence made the house feel less like a memory and more like a place where healing could begin. One afternoon, he stood by the study window, watching the garden. Grace was outside, sitting under a tree with Ethan and Noah. The nurse had wheeled their chairs out into the sunlight, and Grace was reading a story aloud. The boys' faces were turned toward her voice. Their small fingers twitched from time to time, like they were trying to reach for the warmth in her tone. Michael found himself stepping outside, something he hadn't done in months. The sunlight stung his eyes, but the laughter in Grace's voice softened it. He stopped a few feet away, watching quietly. Grace noticed him and smiled politely. "It's good for them to feel the air," she said softly. "The sun helps their nerves relax." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on his sons. "They look different," he said quietly. Grace's smile deepened. "They are," she replied. "They're trying. You can see it in their eyes." He stood beside her for a while, both of them watching the twins. The moment was still, peaceful, but heavy with emotions neither of them could name. That evening, as Grace cleaned the nursery, Michael walked in holding 2 small books. "These were their mother's favorites," he said, his voice uncertain. "Maybe they'd like you to read them." Grace's eyes softened. "Thank you, sir," she said, taking the books carefully. That night, she sat between the boys' beds, reading one of Laura's old bedtime stories. Michael lingered by the door again, unseen. The sound of Grace's voice mixed with the soft breathing of his sons created something almost holy. When she finished reading, she looked at the boys and whispered, "You're safe now. You're loved." The words hit Michael like a wave. He turned away, his chest tight. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that too. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside the mansion. Michael had invited Dr. Andrews, a top neurologist, to evaluate the twins again. The doctor had been there before and had always spoken with the same clinical certainty. Grace stood quietly in the corner as the doctor examined the boys. He ran his usual tests, asked the same questions, and finally stepped back with a sigh. "Mr. Turner, I see no real progress. These reactions you've described are likely reflexes, false signs of improvement. I'm sorry, but medically speaking, their condition remains unchanged." Michael's jaw tightened. "But they spoke," he said firmly. "I heard them. They said a word." The doctor gave a polite but dismissive smile. "Sometimes, under emotional stimulation, involuntary sounds may occur, but don't mistake that for speech." Grace looked down, her heart aching at his coldness. She wanted to speak but held herself back. After the doctor left, Michael sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. The words reflex and false hope played in his mind like a cruel echo. Grace walked in quietly, her steps light. "Don't let his words make you forget what you saw," she said gently. "Doctors see numbers and reports, but they don't see what love can do." Michael lifted his head. His eyes were red, tired but honest. "I want to believe that," he whispered. Grace sat across from him, her voice calm but steady. "Then start by being here, sir. That's what they need most. Presence isn't a skill, it's a choice." Her words stayed with him. That night, instead of retreating to his study, Michael joined Grace in the nursery. He didn't say much, just sat quietly as she read stories and sang softly. When she lifted Ethan's hand to trace a picture in the book, Michael reached out without thinking and helped her guide it. Their hands brushed, and for a moment, the air between them felt warm, real, alive. The twins watched silently, but their eyes were brighter than before. Over the next few days, Michael kept coming back. He began reading short lines from the books, his voice awkward but sincere. The first time he read aloud, his words trembled, but Grace smiled encouragingly. "They don't care if you read perfectly," she whispered. "They just want to hear you." Michael tried again, this time slower. The boys blinked and made small sounds, tiny breaths that carried hope. One evening, Grace helped feed the twins dinner while Michael watched. She spoke to them softly, guiding their spoons. "Good job, Ethan," she said gently. "You're trying, that's what matters." Noah's lips curled slightly, almost like a smile. Michael stared, disbelief filling his heart. "They're responding to you," he said quietly. Grace looked up at him. "They're responding to love, sir," she replied. "Something they've been missing." Her words stung, but not out of insult, because they were true. He had spent years building walls around his pain, and in doing so, had shut out the very thing his children needed most. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Michael found himself standing by the nursery door again. Grace was humming softly while tucking the twins in. The same lullaby filled the air, the one his wife used to sing. He leaned against the doorframe, his voice barely above a whisper. "You sound like her," he said. Grace turned, surprised. "Your wife?" He nodded. "Laura. She used to sing that when I worked late. I'd come home and hear it through the walls. I didn't know how much it meant until it was gone." Grace's eyes softened. "Maybe it was never gone, sir. Maybe it was just waiting for you to listen again." He smiled weakly, tears forming in his eyes. "You really believe that?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because love never disappears. It just waits for the right voice to wake it up." For the first time in years, Michael laughed softly, a small, broken laugh that sounded more like breathing again. That night, before going to bed, he whispered a silent thank you to his late wife. He didn't know what was happening in his home, but for the first time, he didn't want to stop it. Outside, the wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the sound of Grace's lullaby across the mansion. In the nursery, the twins slept peacefully, their small fingers still curled around the edge of their blankets. In that silence, something deeper than science was working, something only love could understand. The weeks turned into months, and the mansion that once felt lifeless was now filled with warmth. Toys lay scattered across the living room floor, soft music played quietly from Grace's small speaker, and the boys' laughter, though faint and broken, echoed like sunlight across every corner of the house. The staff often whispered about the change, saying the twins seemed to have come alive since the maid arrived. But for Michael, it was more than a change. It was a rebirth. Every evening, Michael joined Grace in the nursery. He no longer watched from the doorway. He sat beside her, sometimes helping with stories, other times just listening. He didn't speak much, but Grace could see the difference in his eyes. They were no longer cold. They carried something human again, something gentle. But one morning, everything shifted. Grace received a letter on her small wooden desk. It came from an elite therapy center across the state. They had heard of her work and wanted to offer her a full-time position with better pay and housing. She held the letter in her trembling hands, reading it over and over. It was the kind of job she had once prayed for, yet now it didn't feel like a blessing. That evening, she sat by the window of her small room, looking out at the quiet garden. Her heart was heavy. She thought about Ethan and Noah, about their soft voices and their laughter when she sang. She thought about Michael's tired but kind smile. The mansion no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a home. But she also knew they weren't her children, and she wasn't their family. The next day, she went about her work as usual, pretending nothing was wrong, but Michael noticed the stillness in her eyes. "You're quiet today," he said as he entered the nursery. Grace looked up and forced a small smile. "Just a little tired, sir." He nodded, though he didn't believe it. Later that night, when she was done reading to the twins, he called her into his study. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and the fire burned low in the fireplace. "I can tell when something is bothering you," he said gently. "You've been different since yesterday. Did something happen?" Grace hesitated. Then she sighed softly. "I got a letter," she said, her voice low. "A job offer. From a therapy center in Boston. It's a good opportunity, sir. I haven't decided yet." Michael's heart dropped. "You're thinking of leaving?" She looked down. "I don't know. It's hard. I love the boys, but they're not mine. Maybe it's time for me to move on." Michael leaned back slowly, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. For a moment he couldn't speak. The thought of her leaving brought back the same emptiness he once felt after losing Laura. The silence returned, thick and painful. "Finally," he said quietly, "you're right. They're not yours by blood, but they need you, Grace, more than anyone ever has." Grace swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't want to hurt them by staying too long. Sometimes love means stepping away." Michael looked down at his hands, shaking his head. "And sometimes love means staying, even when it's hard," he said softly. Before she could answer, thunder rumbled outside. The rain started to fall heavily against the windows. In the nursery, the twins began to cry. Michael and Grace rushed upstairs. The storm raged outside as the two boys trembled in their beds. Grace knelt beside them, soothing them with her hands. "It's okay, my loves," she whispered gently. "It's just rain." Michael stood frozen, watching her as she comforted them. She sang softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Lightning flashed through the window, and the boys clung to her. Then it happened. Amid the thunder, Noah opened his mouth and tried to speak. The sound was broken, unclear, but it was a voice. He said something that sounded like, "Ma." Grace's eyes widened. Ethan turned toward her too, his lips moving with effort. "Jay," he tried to say. Michael dropped to his knees beside them, tears streaming down his face. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Grace nodded, her hands shaking as she held the twins close. "They're trying, sir," she said softly, her voice breaking. "They're really trying." For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain beat against the windows, but inside the room, everything felt still. The sound of those broken words filled the space with light. Michael turned to Grace, his voice trembling. "You can't leave," he said quietly. "They need you." "I need you." Grace's heart pounded. "Sir, please don't." He shook his head, cutting her off gently. "This isn't just about the job anymore. You brought life back into this home. You made me see my sons again. You made me feel again. I can't let you walk away." Grace looked at him, tears falling freely now. "I don't know if I deserve that place here," she said softly. Michael stood up, walked to his desk, and returned with an envelope. He placed it in her trembling hands. "This is a guardianship proposal," he said quietly. "It would make you a legal part of their lives. You don't have to be their mother by blood, Grace, but you already are in every way that matters." Grace opened the envelope, staring at the papers inside. Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, she was speechless. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, listening to the rain fade into quiet. In her heart, she knew the answer. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds. The air smelled fresh, alive. Grace walked into the nursery, holding the signed papers in her hands. Michael stood by the window with the twins, the morning light warming their faces. When he saw her, he turned slowly, his eyes questioning. Grace took a deep breath and handed him the papers. "I'll stay," she said simply, her voice shaking. "This is where I belong." Michael's eyes glistened with tears. For a long moment he couldn't speak. He only nodded, his voice caught in his throat. That afternoon, the mansion was filled with laughter again. The twins sat by the window, babbling softly as Grace read to them. Michael watched from behind, a faint smile on his face. The nurse, who had been quiet for days, whispered, "They're improving faster than ever." Grace smiled. "It's love," she said softly. "That's the best medicine there is." Months passed, and the once silent mansion became a home again. On the twins' third birthday, Michael hosted a small family gathering in the garden. Grace stood near the cake, helping the boys blow out their candles. A guest leaned over and asked, "Are you their nanny?" Before Grace could answer, Ethan hugged her leg tightly and said, in a small but clear voice, "Mama." The crowd went silent. Michael looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside a healed man. Later, as the sun began to set, Michael watched Grace push the twins gently on their new swing set. Their laughter filled the air, mixing with the soft rustle of the trees. He walked toward them, his voice calm and full of peace. "You know," he said quietly, "for years this house was just a building. You turned it into a home." Grace smiled, her eyes shining. "Love did that, sir. Love always does." The camera of life closed. On that moment, Grace, Michael, and the twins, under the sunlight, surrounded by laughter, proof that healing doesn't come from money or medicine, but from hearts brave enough to care. Dear viewers, sometimes life's biggest miracles don't come from doctors, money, or science. They come from something simple, something we all carry inside us: love. This story of Michael, Grace, Ethan, and Noah reminds us that love can rebuild what pain has broken, it can bring light where there was once darkness, and it can give life to hearts that forgot how to feel. Michael Turner had everything money could buy, but he had lost everything that truly mattered until one humble maid taught him that love isn't a job, it's a choice. Through patience and kindness, Grace gave those boys a voice and gave their father a reason to believe again. No mansion, no company, no amount of wealth could do what compassion did in that home. Because in the end, the real miracle wasn't that the twins spoke, it was that they were finally heard. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments what you learned from it. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional, real-life stories that will move your heart and remind you that love still exists, even in the coldest places. Because every story you watch here is a story of hope, a story of second chances, and a story that proves love can do what the world calls impossible.